Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Giannetti of the International Housewares Association and Homepage News, and welcome to a special IHA webinar series presentation, breaking down the Lacey Act requirements for wood-based housewares. We'll hear today about how the Lacey Act impacts this business today from Ashley Amidon, who's the Executive Director of the International Wood Products Association. Just a note, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll try to get to as many as we can after Ashley's presentation. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Craig Breithaupt of IHA's Government Affairs Office for some introductory comments before Ashley begins her presentation. Craig, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Peter. My name is Craig Breithaupt, and I represent the IHA, the International Housewares Association, here in Washington, D.C., along with my colleague, Rafe Morrissey, and absolutely delighted to have Ashley with us on an issue that impacts IHA members. And that's what we do here as the government affairs function for IHA. We want to make sure and keep track of and impact where necessary any issues that are happening that could impact IHA members, and this issue surely will. And with that, let me give you a brief introduction of our guest today. Ashley Amidon, our guest speaker, is, as Peter said, Executive Director of the International Wood Products Association. And she is one of the foremost authorities on the Lacey Act. The Lacey Act has been in place since 1900. But there's a big change that is going to be coming as a result of an amendment to the law in 2008, greatly expanding the law's coverage through the intervening years, where it is the Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service is going to have some new requirements that all IHA members need to know about, and particularly those that have products that will be covered. The Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, rightly so, thought so highly of Ashley and the International Wood Products Association that in anticipation of this important development, gave Ashley and the IWPA a grant to spread the word. She in turn reached out to IHA President Derek Miller and Peter in February, knowing a substantial number of IHA member company products would be covered by the new Lacey Act requirements. Ashley is no stranger to IHA. Since February, we've gotten to know each other quite well. And in fact, she did an education session at this year's Inspired Home Show in March of this year. And now we're delighted that she can join us to do this webinar as we continue to be engaged in this with the goal of making sure that all IHA members that may be impacted by this know about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our expert, Ashley Amidon. Take it away, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Craig, for such a wonderful introduction. You called me a foremost expert, so I feel like now I'm going to have to know the answer to every single question you guys pop in the chat. No pressure, right? Truly, though, I'm really excited to be chatting with everyone today and to be back before the IHA. We are going to cover quite a bit of ground today, but I will definitely leave time for questions at the end. So with that, let's kick it off. Oh, there we go. So the obligatory disclaimer that the lawyers in my association make me put up here, I am not going to read the whole thing, but essentially what you should take away from this is that this presentation and any questions I might answer don't constitute legal advice. If you have questions about how the Lacey Act or anything else that we're going to talk about pertains to your company, your supply chain, that's something you should talk about with your counsel, or perhaps find counsel if you have those sorts of questions. I also want to point out that this, our education program, which I'll get a little more into later on, was started with seed funding from the US and the UK governments, as well as a nonprofit, the World Resources Institute. And again, this presentation and all of our education is the responsibility of IWPA. It doesn't reflect the official US, UK government perspective. And if you've got any questions about that, feel free to ask them in the chat. All right, with the boring legal stuff out of the way, here is what we're going to talk about today. So we'll cover briefly the Lacey Act history, as well as the 2008 amendments, which bring in plant products. We will talk about what is out and what is in when it comes to these requirements. We'll talk a little bit about the declaration, jail fines and other enforcement fun. And then what does compliance look like? And then what do you need to know about complying later this year? And then, of course, time for questions. So I am going to very, very briefly walk through the Lacey Act history. I think it's important to know just because it informs the way that the Lacey Act is in effect now. So 1900, unfortunately, we can blame the ladies for this law. The fashion at that time, if you've ever looked at sort of turn of the century Gibson girl looks, were these gigantic hats with tons and tons of feathers, in some cases multiple whole birds like jammed onto a hat. And because of this, there was a great demand for all of these bird feathers. And it was causing, in some cases, overhunting. And different states were trying to pass laws to be able to protect the birds within their state, but people were trafficking them across state lines. And, you know, if you're hunting in Pennsylvania, selling into Virginia and New York, Pennsylvania can't go after you. So this piece of legislation called the Lacey Act was championed by Representative John Lacey, who was a member of the House of Representatives, who was an ardent conservationist. And he really championed the passage of a law that would help protect birds across the nation, no matter where they were hunted or sold. And so originally Lacey deals with interstate commerce, and the sort of importation is an afterthought. It's in there, but it is really focused on protecting commerce across state lines. Between 1900 and 2008, there are 6 amendments that are made to the Lacey Act. It's not important for our discussion today, really, what they are. You bring in things like seafood, for instance, in the 80s, you establish corporate responsibility as well as individual. But I always like mentioning this because I want people to walk away understanding that this is a big law with a lot of case history and a lot of just general history behind it. This isn't a new invention that comes in 2008 when plant products are covered. All right, so then we move to 2008 and plant products are added. The 2008 Farm Bill, which, do you remember those days? We had bipartisan farm bills, crazy time. Plant products are added in this 2008 Farm Bill. And it's really interesting because there is a change. They're not just added in the way that like seafood was, for instance, where, okay, under this umbrella of Lacey, now you have these additional products. There's a change in that they added declaration. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is, but that is a new aspect as of 2008. So this declaration is called, if you want to talk about it in the official government speak, it's the PPQ 505, but for our purposes, you can also call it the declaration or import declaration. And I'm not going to quote the legislative language to you, but really what you should take away from the 2008 amendments is that you being anyone in commerce, right? You are forbidden from buying, selling, importing, etc., any plant product that has been illegally taken. Now, I always like to talk about what illegally taken means, right? Because I think we can all imagine how you could be a criminal and steal, right? You can jump into your neighbor's concession and go take their, harvest a really high value tree. And obviously that product is going to be illegal, right? There's no disagreement there. But the Lacey Act is much broader than just that blatant criminal aspect. It means any law that's broken. So for instance, if you have OSHA or OSHA equivalent, if you're in another country, violations, if there are foreign corrupt practices, if there's a CITES issue, if there are Canada, for instance, when you harvest, you have to pay a stump tax. If your stump taxes aren't paid, it doesn't even have to be a knowing violation. Right? It could be you didn't realize that you needed to file some special permit, or you underestimated the amount of payment by mistake. That would still make that product illegally taken. So again, getting back to that history of Lacey, We are going to talk about a lot of it in the context of importation, right? Because that's when you file the declaration. But again, I want to emphasize this also means crossing state lines. So if you are buying wood from Oregon or plant products or inputs or pieces, and then it's being shipped to a distribution center in Virginia and being sold in Georgia, right? The Lacey Act is going to apply because you're crossing state lines. Okay, so what are some of the covered IHA products? Your IHA team was kind enough to give me some examples. This is not going to be comprehensive, but I wanted to give you guys just a little bit of a sense up front of what are some of the products that might be considered. Truly, it is anything with plant or plant products in it, but some examples that you guys might be familiar with: cutting boards, spice mills, baskets. I have stars by bamboo products and essential oils because there's some nuances there that we'll talk about. So there are two primary responsibilities under the Lacey Act. The first we've talked a little bit about, right? It is the responsibility to conduct legal trade. Now, this is for the entire supply chain. There is, I think, a lot of confusion among folks because they're like, oh, I'm not the importer, right? I'm further down in the supply chain. Somebody else handles the importation. Lacey covers everyone. So if someone 3 steps back is the importer and they've made a mistake and this product is in violation of the Lacey Act, you still bear responsibility. So that is something that, you know, is really important to walk away today from, is that no matter where you are in the supply chain, if you're trading plant or plant products, this is going to apply to you. The second is that a Lacey Act declaration is a separate responsibility. So the declaration I mentioned, you know, was added in 2008. It wasn't added for all products immediately because the government recognized that, you know, this would bring in a huge amount of products and they still sort of needed to figure out how this would work. So when Lacey Act passes, or the amendments passed in 2008, declarations start being filed in 2009, and it primarily fell on folks like my members, right? So if you're bringing in a log, very, very obviously plant or plant products. And the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, is the government agency that's tasked with dealing with the declaration. They're under USDA. So APHIS has slowly but surely been phasing in products by HTS codes under the declaration. So for those of you that are thinking, well, I trade in plant or plant products or have them in my larger products, but I've never had to file a declaration, you're still covered by the Lacey Act. The Lacey Act covers all plant and plant products since 2008, period, end of sentence. And so it is this separate overlapping responsibility that is now coming online with this phased-in declaration approach. So the declaration is only filed for an importer of record. It's not needed if you're crossing state lines. But that declaration, and we'll talk a little bit about it, is something that will be legally required later this year for a wide variety of product categories. So what APHIS has said is that this new phase, they're calling it phase 7, will come into effect 6 months after the publication of the notice in the Federal Register. We expect that at any time. It's literally sitting, waiting to be signed and put in the Federal Register right now. So it could be tomorrow, it could be 2 weeks from now, but either way, there will be a 6-month window from that. And the plan is that it will cover every single product except paper and pure composites like an MDF or hardwood. So just be aware that if you are trading in plant or plant products and it's not paper, you are likely going to be covered by the declaration later this year. So I've mentioned that this covers the whole supply chain. This is something that I think is a little different for people to wrap their head around, is that, you know, if it is illegal in one place in the supply chain, then that illegality flows down, right? You don't at any point get to wash away the illegality. If a law has been broken at some point, from any point on, it is now an illegal product. So what that means practically, right, is that obviously if you're an importer of record, there will be a higher level of responsibility because you're the one quite literally filing the paperwork. But if you're not an importer of record, if you're further down that supply chain, you still have to do due diligence to ensure that the product or products or parts of your products, that all of that is legally harvested under the Lacey Act. You do not have to know a crime was committed to have liability. And that's something that I think can be really scary for a lot of businesses, right? Because we are used to saying like, okay, like I know the paperwork I have to file. And if I, file my taxes every year and pay what I need to and all of that, like I'm good. And that's all within my control. And therefore I know that I'm following the law. Lacey is not like that. Someone much further up the supply chain could have made a mistake, knowingly or unknowingly, and that can fall to you when it comes to liability. So what does this mean for you? You have to know your supply chain, you have to know your product, and you have to know your supplier. And, you could, I'm sure many of you do have a lot of different product lines and probably very, very complicated supply chains that reach all over the US and all over the world. And you probably deal with a lot of suppliers. So this can seem really scary to know that you have to investigate every single supplier, all of your supply chains, and know that all of your products are being legally traded. We like to think of this when we talk about it in the context of our education courses as source, species, supplier. If you have confidence in your source, your species, and your supplier, you are really close to being, good to go for Lacey, as good to go as you can be anyway. So this is something as you either tweak a compliance program that you have or build one from the ground up, if you need to, these three things are really important to remember. So the question I always get is what is not covered, right, by the declaration? So pallets used for dunnage. So if you're shipping in products and you've got pallets that, the products are strapped to or between, you don't need a declaration for those pallets. But if you're bringing in a container full of pallets, essentially the pallet is the product, then you would need a declaration for that. Common cultivars. So these are commodities that are essentially cultivated, right? So an example of that would be corn, right? A lot of food products are in here. However, there is a link and you can just Google APHIS common cultivars or Lacey common cultivars, and it will come up with a very handy website that APHIS has put together where you can search your product. So you can put in cotton, for instance, and you can see what parts are covered by the declaration and what parts are not. It's important, even if you think you have a cultivated product, to check, because there are products in there where certain parts of the plant are covered and certain parts are not. So there will be some cultivars that are listed and it will say, the essential oils do require a declaration, but nothing else does. So I always recommend that people just, check that and then you can sign up for updates if APHIS does update that. But it's important to check individual products and make sure the whole product is covered. This is another common question I get, and I don't know that many of you trade in CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, but if you do, this does not mean that you don't have to worry about filing a declaration. I think a lot of people think that, oh, I've got a CITES permit, right? I don't have to worry about also a Lacey declaration. They are totally separate permits. CITES is an international body that the US belongs to. The Lacey Act is a US law. So just because you have a CITES permit doesn't mean you're exempt from either filing from a declaration perspective for Lacey or that you're exempt from Lacey. So I mentioned bamboo, and because I know quite a few of you use or create products that have bamboo in them. So the difference for bamboo is going to be whether it's cultivated or not. So if you have cultivated bamboo, and this would be essentially you've got a bamboo that is being specifically planted with the purpose of being able to be harvested and then using commercially, right? If you have a bamboo plantation, then that is called cultivated bamboo, and you do not need a declaration for that. However, if you have wild bamboo, if you have unknown bamboo, you're not sure whether it's cultivated or not, or you have a mix of cultivated and not cultivated, then you do have to do a declaration. Now, this is going to be, I think, particularly important for anyone that sells bamboo products, where you may have had some of these components that, were harvested prior to when that declaration comes into effect. For instance, bamboo that's being harvested right now, right? You may or may not be tracking whether it's cultivated or not. But if it takes a while, there's supply chain disruptions, or you have, some creation of the product before it's imported into the United States, and it's after that implementation deadline, then you're gonna have to file a declaration for it unless you are very, very sure that it is cultivated. This is something that I'm gonna emphasize throughout is documentation, right? Whatever you're doing for compliance, whether it's on bamboo or anything else, you need to document what you're doing and why you're doing it so that if there are ever any questions, it's not, I don't know, Steve, who used to work in compliance, told me that it was cultivated. Like, that's not going to be good enough for Department of Justice. You need to have a paper trail. So whatever your product mix is when it comes to bamboo, just make sure to document it. And, you know, the import declaration does need to be filed if it's not cultivated. And again, APHIS has some guidance specifically on bamboo. You can go to the common cultivar section, it'll link you from there, or you can just literally Google Lacey Act APHIS bamboo and it'll pop up. All right, so I mentioned that there is this phased in approach for the declaration and that we're about to enter phase 7, and that we will have this 6-month implementation period. At this point, it looks like it's probably going to be late May or early June, which puts us, you know, basically November, late November-ish, for this implementation deadline. That 6 months, that's going to be a really important time for folks like you on this webinar to sort of get your purchasing, your sales departments up to speed on what's required. So I'm very impressed that IHA has done, you know, a lot of this proactive outreach to members, because there are other associations that are unfortunately not doing that. And I'm worried that their members will be caught out once this is listed in the Federal Register. So, and again, I mentioned it is expected to cover everything but composite wood products. So the way that APHIS defined composites is paper, paperboard, particle board, and medium and high density fiberboard. So MDF and HDF. Those, as far as we are aware, and this has been communicated to me verbally by APHIS, those are going to be the only exemptions. If you have a product that is mixed, for instance, you have part of it is particle board and part of it is bamboo that was not cultivated, right? You're still going to have to file a declaration. If any part of the product requires a declaration, then all of it does. So don't think that just because, you know, you have mainly MDF something and it's got a tiny little wooden handle on it, that doesn't make you exempt. So what is included on the declaration? So there's sort of 2 categories very broadly. There's basic business information about the shipment, which hopefully should be pretty easy for everybody to fill in. And then there's wood or product specific information. And I do want to emphasize, if anyone is sitting here being like, well, I'm not the importer, so like this declaration thing is good to know for my supply chain, but not for me. This is something that should follow the product, right? So if you are 10 steps down the line, asking for a copy of the declaration can actually be a part of your compliance program. So it's good to be familiar with what is included on it, because we'll talk when we get to the part about compliance, we'll talk about red flags. And if someone sends you a declaration that doesn't seem correct or reflective of the product that you have, that's a good thing to know about your supplier and your product. So what's included? We have the information like, you know, the name of the importer, who it's going to, container number, the HTS code, you know, contact information, nothing crazy here. This is where it can get a little more complicated. And I have species and genus bolded because this is the part that trips people up. There are a lot of products that go by trade names, right? Or it might even internally, you might refer to it by a product line. That's not sufficient for the declaration. You have to have species and genus. And so it's important that whoever is filling out the declaration is aware of the scientific names of the products that might be in your product. Now, I do get this question a lot. Well, I have multiple types of wood, multiple species, right, that could be in my product. Well, then you need to list them. What you don't want is for you to put down 2 species and could have been the third, you weren't sure. And they do wood ID testing and find out that there's that third, and all of a sudden you have a violation. So it's very important to be thorough. You don't want to overlist just for the sake of it, right? This is not the time to put 100 different species down. Whatever you put, you want to be consistent and you want to justify it in writing internally. So if you know, like, hey, we regularly do this cutting board and it has 3 different types of wood in it. Some cutting boards may only have 2, some may have all 3, but we import it regularly and it could have up to these 3. Well, then you probably want to put those 3 on every single declaration and make sure to document internally why you have done that. so that if you ever do have Department of Justice coming back to you saying, hey, we tested, we only have 2 of these 3, why is the 3rd listed? You can say, hey, we've actually got a paper trail on that. Here you go. Problem solved, hopefully. And then, of course, things like the quantity in metric, country of harvest, and value of the product. So I've just got a copy of the PPQ 505 up here. It's actually filed electronically for the most part now. The customs broker can file it through the ACE system, and then APHIS has their online system called LAWGS, LAWGS, because they just love a good acronym. And they just actually updated LAWGS, I think today or last night. So, but this is a copy of the paper just so you can sort of see all of the information in one place. So I've talked a little bit about how Lacey is a strict liability law. The problem is that what you should do to comply, do care, is not defined or specified anywhere. It's not in the underlying text. There hasn't been a bunch of guidance that's been released. So it's really every company having to do their best and hope that it's enough, which from a business perspective is incredibly frustrating and not a little terrifying, right? However, there have been some big enforcement actions. And because those settlements have been made public, those settlements actually are very helpful when it comes to looking at what compliance looks like. Now, you have to remember that obviously if a company has been found guilty of violating the Lacey Act, right, they've, whether it's criminal or civil, they've done something wrong. So those settlements are going to differ a little bit depending on what exactly they did wrong. But if you look at them collectively, you can see that there are certain themes, certain things that the government is looking for in every single settlement. And so being able to draw those out is really helpful. And it helps us as a broad industry think about what does compliance look like. Now I'm going to walk through these enforcement cases, and I'm only going to walk through 5. And I don't want you walking away thinking like, oh, there's only been 5 cases, like law of averages, I'm fine. These are the big cases, right? With the big settlements. There are many, many actions that are never publicly disclosed where there's a small fine, where the product is destroyed, where it's denied entry at a port. Like, please don't think that these are the only cases, but these are the 5 big ones where we have those public settlements. So before we cover that, these are the 3 types of violations that you can have under the Lacey Act. They're civil, criminal, misdemeanor, criminal, felony. I'm not going to walk through each of them individually, but you can see on the penalty side, that right column, there are serious fines, especially once you get down towards the criminal felony side of things. Because you see that you're like, oh, $500,000, right? If you're a corporation, like that's not ideal, but like a lot of very large corporations could manage that, right? Might not be budgeted, but they'll be okay. But it's or twice the gross gain or loss. That $500,000 fine is the floor, not the ceiling. The other thing I want to draw your eye to is how in each of these penalty cases, even under civil, forfeiture of goods. If you violate the Lacey Act, you do not get to keep the product. Again, sort of period, end of sentence. That is how the government views this. So there is no way that you can pay a fine and still keep it. So if you've got, one of your major product lines, right, and you find out something's wrong with it, like all of that is getting seized and destroyed. The government does destroy most things that are found as a Lacey Act violation. Occasionally they will donate it to something like Habitat for Humanity, but it actually goes with paperwork that says it can never enter the stream of commerce ever. So the intention is that if you violate it, it is removed from the stream of commerce. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is under the left column, the first box, civil penalty, right? It does not depend on defendant's knowledge of illegality. I know I probably sound like a broken record, but this is something that is so important to grasp about the Lacey Act, is that you cannot know you broke a law and still be guilty. So let's talk about what it has cost other folks. So the biggest, probably the most famous case has been the Gibson guitar case. You may remember this, 2012, if you Google it, this Gibson Guitar Lacey Act, they actually raided Gibson's offices, like armed agents, took out computers, like it was a really big deal, even in the press. Gibson, this was the first really big case. So you'll notice the penalties aren't too bad at this point, right? Only 350K. Because keep in mind the penalties that we looked at, that 500,000 floor, those change. They do update those every couple of years for inflation. So 350K penalties in community service. What I want to emphasize that I always find fascinating and terrifying about the Gibson case is Gibson was not the importer of record. The importer of record was actually a small one-woman shop called Luthier's International. She was the one that imported, that she then sold on to Gibson, who then obviously creates beautiful guitars. But we call it the Gibson guitar case. We don't call it the Luthier's International case. And so I always like to emphasize this for businesses that are further down the supply chain. I mean, the US government is going to go after people that they feel have wrongdoing, right? But also that they can get some of that money out. This is not to imply that Luthier's International walked away, but this is really a Gibson guitar case. So a little scary, but keep in mind that the government is going to go after deeper pockets and then everyone behind, right? So J&L Tonewoods, I mentioned interstate commerce. This is an interstate commerce violation of Lacey. So they were illegally harvesting maple wood in a national forest and then selling it across state lines. The company is now out of business. It was a very small, like family-owned company, just a couple of folks. And so multiple people got a year in prison. They had probation and then restitution, and the company folded because they couldn't bear all of this. The third case is Lumber Liquidators. Now they're known as LL. So they had two issues. There was a customs issue and under Lacey. And this is a really interesting case because it demonstrates that any violation, right, becomes a Lacey violation. So it was a customs issue, which was quite frankly ditto in the Gibson guitar case, right? Customs classification issue. And then that, because it is violation of law regarding a plant or plant product, you can put Lacey on top of it. So it's kind of like if a cop pulls you over for the broken headlight, but then they see you have guns and drugs in the back seat, right? Like they're going to be looking, and I say they, enforcement agencies are going to be looking for anything that's off about a shipment, and then it can be folded into the Lacey Act. So the government actually supervised their business for 5 years, and they owed $13 million in penalties and payments. So let me move to 2017. This was a really interesting case because Young Living actually self-reported. They did some internal work and realized like, oh no, we're doing things that are not right. And they went to the government and said, hey, like we want to essentially work with you, like whistleblowing on ourselves, I suppose would be the best way to phrase that. Still $760K in penalties and payments. As you can see from each of these settlements, the US government is stepping up what they expect you to pay, how long the compliance plan is, because there is now, and I've heard Department of Justice talk about this law has been around for a while now, since 2008, right? There's an expectation that if you're covered by the Lacey Act, you've had time to adjust your supply chains, to adjust your compliance. So they're holding companies to a higher standard with every year that goes by. The last, and this was actually an update since I chatted with you all in February at the home show. They were just sentenced in 2024 on Valentine's Day, oddly enough. It was a couple out of Florida. They were, again, it was a customs issue. They were essentially trying to get around duties that were on product from China. And so they were lying about it and shipping it and saying it was from other countries. And so they owe a little over $42 million in forfeiture and then 1.6 million to cover storage costs, because when they were caught, some of the product was actually out of port. And so they had to store it till the case was over. Each of the couple was sentenced to 57 months in prison, 3 years supervised release, and then they're not allowed to ever engage in business related to Lacey products. There was an office manager as well who had assisted them. She was an accessory. I don't think she got jail time, but she got fined and they got home. She had to stay at home for a while. Okay, so what does this mean practically for you? So your company has to care because it's the law, right? That's very obvious to say. I know that you're part of a trade association. You're on this webinar. You clearly want to follow the law. You're not looking to be a criminal. However, it's also an ethical way to do business. And that's good because not only does no one here want to trade in international or in illegal products, but because it means that it's something that you can talk about as part of a broader commitment to doing business right? When it comes to, if you've got a DEI program or the way you treat your employees, it's also, hey, we're making sure that we're trading in accordance with laws all around the world. So one of the things that I always like to emphasize when I'm teaching these courses is that when you create a due care program internally, it can't be something that you create and then like once a year you bring it out, you're like, oh, this still looks good. Okay, put it back on the shelf, right? It is something that you have to show that you are constantly following, constantly updating. The lumber liquidators case, part of the reason that they got in trouble is not only did they do some things that were illegal, but they had actually a pretty robust standard operating procedure when it came to doing compliance and due care. They were not following it. They were not updating it. It was literally sitting on a shelf somewhere. And so they tried to pull that out and say, look at all this great, requirements we have and all these things. And DOJ was like, okay, but are you doing any of them? And they were like, well, no, but we have it, right? That's not a good defense. So making sure that you are continuously improving and expanding your compliance program is really important if you ever do face questions. So what does due care mean, roughly? And again, I have to go back to that initial disclaimer. This is not legal advice. This is something you guys are going to need to look at your own source, supplier, and product and figure out. But these are some good baselines to think about as you're either creating or expanding that due care program. So if you're an importer of record, you have to file that declaration and you have to conduct due care, right? Everyone in the supply chain needs to exercise due care. So those are two important things. It also, it's helpful not only because it hopefully screens out illegal products, but it also limits your exposure to those civil criminal charges and exclusion of entry. Because again, if DOJ comes to you and they say, hey, we have a question about this particular shipment, we think it violates the Lacey Act, right? You will be able to pull out a ton of work that you as a company have done and say, hey, we don't actually think that's true. Here's why, right? And that's going to be considered because the Department of Justice has made it very clear, like explicitly clear, that they will weigh the level of due diligence that you have done when they're considering prosecution. So let's say worst case scenario, DOJ comes to you and says, hey, I think you violated the Lacey Act. You pull out binders and binders. You've done everything you need to. It's still illegal and somehow you missed it, right? You are likely going to have significantly lower fines because you've done everything you could and it still slipped through. It happens, right? But you've shown that you've done everything you could to try to eliminate the possibility. So the more work you do, the better off you will be if, God forbid, you do ever have an enforcement case. But what does due care mean? So these are the three concepts that are really important in your due care program. So you have to evaluate your supply chain for risk or supply chains. And again, this is going to be something deeply personal to your company. You need to look at all of your supply chains and figure out where there might be risk. So an example of that would be, if you have a product, whether you're the importer of record or further down the chain, but you have a product that comes from a country where there are a couple regions that have a lot of child labor issues, right? And you know this because there's news reports all the time. You keep an eye on ENGO reports. The UN has done some work on it, right? It is well known that certain regions of this country have child labor. Well, your products don't come from those regions, but it still is within the country or close by, right? So that might be something that you, when you're looking at your supply chain, would say, hey, this could be risky for us, either from a public perception or from an actual perspective. Well, then you need to find ways to mitigate that risk, right? So one way might be doing a spot check, right? You show up at that factory and say, hey, I'm here. I want to walk around your floor right now without you knowing I'm coming and, being able to figure out, move any children off the floor, right? You can walk on the floor and you look around, you're like, okay, I don't see any kids. I want to take a look at your, employee manuals, right? Like what in there, how are you checking IDs? Like all of these things that show that you are cognizant there could be a risk and you're looking at ways to reduce it. And maybe, this is a supplier you've worked with for a really long time. You have a great trusting relationship. So maybe only do that every couple of years, right? But you still have it built in. And then you can go back and you can justify and say, hey, we have evaluated the risk that, there could be child labor close by. Here are the ways that we have mitigated that risk internally. And this is why we feel confident continuing to trade and confident knowing that there's not child labor being used. These are the three big categories of risk that most people deal with. So your source, right? We've already talked about, oh, somewhere in the country could have child labor, right? So there could be a lot of different breakdowns of where that source might have risk. Some of it is the country as a whole, right? Some of it might be that regional base, and then sometimes it's a specific forest unit. Species. So this species risk could be something if it is on the CITES, that Convention on International Trade Endangered Species list, or a species that's very high value. And you read a lot of reports because you're obviously, as part of your due diligence, reading environmental group reports, reading UN reports, reading US government reports, and you see some reports about how this is very high value. It could be something that's targeted by people that want to do criminal activities, right? So that could be a risk. And then your supplier or your supply chain. And this is where we talk a lot about red flags. So for instance, let's say that you have a supplier that you've worked with for a really long time. And you're like, I want to come visit you. And they're like, sure, come on down, right? So you show up and they don't let you go to certain parts of the factory, or they only let you talk with certain employees, or they require that their translator is the one doing all the translation. Things where you just get that gut feeling that something might be wrong. It's important that you internally document when you have those concerns, because sometimes trading with them might not be the right step going forward. But it's important to ask a lot of good questions to your supplier. We do a lot of courses for our industry, and we always talk about due care is learning to ask the right questions of the right people. So it's knowing when you get a bad feeling in your stomach, when information's being withheld, when you're not getting access to the things you need, when you ask a question like, hey, what is your, how are you complying with all local laws? And they're like, oh, we are, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it is the worst answer you can get. So being aware of the source, species, and supplier aspects are really important. So how do you start? I know it sounds silly, but communicating your commitment to trade only in legally harvested wood is really important. We tell people, get a written commitment from your suppliers, right? Build that into your contract saying, hey, Amidon, Cutting Boards, Inc., we only want to trade in legal, sustainably harvested species. And by entering this contract, you agree with that. I'm sure a lawyer would have very different drafting ideas, but that is the basic tenet, right? You need to identify the species and ask questions about their due care systems and how the material was harvested. And by ask questions, I don't mean emailing them and saying, hey, Joe, you guys have due care, right? Like you do that, you follow all the laws. Like you don't want to ask a leading question like that, because they're like, you're a customer. They're going to be like, yeah, you're fine. Don't worry about it, right? Instead, you want to say, hey, tell me about your due care. What do you do? It needs to be much more open-ended so that you can have a better sense of what they're actually doing. You need to consider tracking and traceability issues. There is a lot of technology out there that can help you with that. And then a lot of companies have their own internal tracking where they're able to, track things moving through the supply chain. This can be really helpful if you ever do have a question that, or DOJ comes to you and says, hey, we have a concern about this product, and it's already sort of further down the supply chain. Knowing where that is will allow you to stop it and pull it from the stream of commerce much easier. Requiring critical supply chain suppliers to provide greater documentation. So by that, I mean, if you have, let's say you have 10 product lines, but 2 of those product lines are like 80% of your business, and they come from 2 suppliers, you're probably going to want to do a lot more work on those simply because it is a larger portion of your business. Considering scientific tools available. So there are a lot of very, very smart academics and trade folks that are looking at what does wood ID look like, right? Scientifically, are there ways you can do it in the field? How can you trace things throughout the supply chain? So there are a lot of those things that are online or are coming online in the next 5 to 10 years, and sort of keeping up with that sort of thing is going to be really important. And then what third parties can help you. So there are auditing firms, certifiers, lawyers, hate to mention them, necessary evil, apologize to any lawyers on here, trade associations, universities, even environmental groups. They do a lot of reporting, so being aware of those is really important. And then documenting. We've talked, I feel like, ad nauseum about this, but being able to document your own research and actions is really important. Think of it, you have a lot of institutional knowledge that resides with people in your company. What if they leave? If the DOJ knocks on your door and says, hey, we have a question about the shipment from 4 years ago, and you're like, well, Brad handled that and he's not here anymore, that's not really an option. You need to be able to have that information handy. I always like to think of it as equivalent to your financial records, right? If the IRS comes to you in 3 years from now, you can't be like, well, my accountant has changed. I don't know. You got to find it. And so thinking of it at the same level of importance, I think is pretty helpful. And then I have to say, take IWPA training for more tips and tricks. Our industry, we've been covered by the declaration and by Lacey since the beginning. So we in 2015 determined that it was better for us as an industry to share information. So we hold industry courses. We've actually got two coming up in June. If anybody is free, either the 4th in LA or the 6th in North Carolina near Greensboro, they're free under the grant. They're not normally. But we try to provide industry-focused education, and it is only open to industry. There's no government folks in the room, no enforcement, no environmental groups. It is literally just people involved in the trade, in supply chains, because we want people to feel safe to ask any question they'd like. So how do you prove Lacey Act compliance? And this is probably the biggest question I get. And the bad news is there isn't an easy way. There is no checklist that you can offer, that you can just go through and say, I've got these 6 things, right? There's no set of documents. It is not a one size fits all. What works for one company won't work for another. It is evaluating and mitigating your risk and then documenting it. That is the best way that you can prove Lacey Act compliance. And as I mentioned, sometimes it's making the hard call not to trade. Sometimes the supplier is not right anymore. Sometimes the source is too risky. So last but not least, because I want to make sure we leave time for questions, and I realize I've talked a little longer than I intended to, this is a good example when you want to think about where does liability rest. So this is a very, very simplified supply chain. Again, I know a lot of supply chains have many more steps, but fit so many words. So let's say in the simplified supply chain that the concession owner breaks a law. They are over harvesting. They are not getting the right permits, whatever it is, right? That illegality flows throughout the entire chain. Now, I'll be honest, it is exceedingly unlikely the government is going to go after a consumer. I mean, technically under the law, they could, but let's be honest, they're not going to. So really, that liability goes through every other step up to the brand name company that sells to the consumer. So no matter where you are in this chain, it's important to remember that you still have to care about the Lacey Act. So with that, I will turn to Craig and whoever else is moderating for questions, and happy to take them. And then if you need more information or you just want to learn more about our education, there's a handy dandy QR code there.
Well, thank you, Ashley. We have a couple questions coming in, and there's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A. Craig, why don't you take this one for her?
Happy to do it. Ashley, we have a question from Amir. I'm just going to use your first name. Does FSC certification help? Will that help in terms of being in compliance with the Lacey Act?
This is actually a question I get often enough. I really ought to put it in my presentation. FSC is a helpful tool when it comes to doing compliance, right? It is another way that you can track your products, that you can have more confidence internally. It does not provide a pass for Lacey Act. If the DOJ comes to you and say, hey, we have a problem with a shipment or a product, whatever it is, and you say, well, it's FSC certified, they will say some much more lawyerly equivalent to that's great, that doesn't answer my question. So it's important, whether you have FSC or not, to maintain documentation that you think will fill the need of being able to prove due care. Again, this is not me trashing FSC or PFC or SFI or any of the other programs that are out there. They're can be really helpful for companies that need to know a place to start on due diligence, but it is not sufficient to comply with Lacey.
Very good. We've got another question that has come in from Cindy. Is there a logo or trademark that buyers can look for on finished goods which shows compliance?
No, and that's a really great question, because there is no way that you can say I am 100% Lacey compliant, because you don't know that, right? You do your best as a company, you do your utmost, you have all your documentation, but there is no check mark that is given at any point in the process that said that this is 100% Lacey compliant. So I've seen people try to do something like that, and I as a trade association will talk with them and say like, hey, it's actually not accurate. And I don't know trademark law enough, and advertising law, but that is certainly not accurate advertising. And I'll leave it at that.
I've got a question, Ashley, related to enforcement. Can we presume that with the import declaration coming and all this recent activity, that we're entering what might be a heightened enforcement period for the Lacey Act?
Absolutely, and it's not just because of the new phased-in approach. The enforcement arm of sort of the Lacey Act, and I say that DOJ is the face of prosecution. But if you have something that stops at a port, so exclusion of entry, you're immediately going to be dealing with CBP and Fish and Wildlife. And, you look at the Gibson guitar case, there's Fish and Wildlife agents that were armed and raiding, the Gibson guitar factory. So there's a lot of different agencies. There is DOJ, APHIS, Fish and Wildlife, CBP, and Forest Service now does testing. So they will, if they pull your shipment because they're concerned there's an issue, they will send a piece of it to be tested by Forest Service to see if it's really the species that you say it is on the declaration. So there's been a lot more coordination within the last year and a half. There's been more funding put towards this. And, quite frankly, with the administration, the Biden administration being very focused on stopping deforestation, they've rolled in Lacey Act to that quite blatantly. There's a lot of different factors that I think are going to pressure the enforcement agencies to try to find more enforcement cases. And, to your point, Peter, you have a lot of people coming into the declaration that I'm sure they're not IHA members, but, there are some folks out there that were not even aware that they were covered by Lacey and now are going to be filing a declaration. And so they're going to have to scrabble to play catch up. And, there can be mistakes that are made if you're playing catch up. So I personally would not be surprised by more enforcement cases.
Good.
We've got a question here from Ian. Is there a place we can see example documentation and documents so that we can be sure our suppliers are giving us legitimate documentation?
Awesome question. And I'm going to sound a little bit like I'm tooting my own horn. That's one of the things we cover in our in-person courses. There is no one place that you can say like, hey, this is an export permit from this province in China, and here's exactly what it looks like. But we do teach you how to look for red flags. So like one of our instructors has basically taken a permit, it's from China, and she's blocked out identifying information, but she's shown, and it was a permit that was sent to her, a real one that was sent to her, and she shows you how to look at some of the numbers and see when things don't match up, or the background is kind of off around the date. It is no like central database. That would be amazing if one was ever created. But it is really up to each individual company to have to go over things with a fine-tooth comb. It can be a very frustrating experience for someone that's used to complying with other US laws, where you can go to a website and be like, this is what this permit looks like, and if you have it, you're good, right? There isn't anything centrally available like that. Neither is there a listing of every law in every country. So you really have to do a lot of research on your own to figure out what laws even apply.
I'm going to follow up quickly on that question and your answer. Is this what is meant by the chain of custody provision in terms of having to be knowledgeable at every step of the way?
Yeah, so chain of custody is really important the further down you are in a supply chain, right? So let's say, and here, let me see if I can go back. No, I can't. Just kidding. Here, let me go back to this example because I think this will help. So, if you are, for instance, the purchasing company, right? So right up here, I think you can probably see my mouse. The chain of custody is pretty short, right? Concession to harvester to initial processor to purchasing company. And so it's relatively short. And so it's relatively easy to say, hey, as purchasing company, I want to see the harvest permits from the concession owner. I want to see, from the harvester, and I want to see the permits that you have to allow harvesting, right? Like you can ask for a couple specific things because it's only a couple steps. If you go all the way down here to say the finisher or the brand name company, you got to ask for a lot of different things from a lot of different steps. And so the chain of custody becomes a lot more opaque. It becomes harder to track, particularly if you have a lot of inputs from a lot of places. And so you can, I'll be very frank, most companies, even really small ones, have a full-time compliance person because this is something that is not, I saw one company that had it with, it was very small. They had a part-time accountant who also did HR and who also did compliance. And I was like, oh Lord, like you're giving me heart palpitations. Like this is a very complicated process. So chain of custody is something that is really essential for you to establish when it comes to all of your products. Because if DOJ comes knocking on your door and they say, hey, where is this from? And you can only trace it back to, say, the US importer record, that is not a complete chain of custody.
Thank you. And thanks for allowing me to jump in there with a follow-up. We've got several more questions here. We've got one from someone who's just indicated they are an anonymous attendee, but we're glad you're on and you're interested in the subject matter. Does the Lacey Act require geolocation coordinates like the EUDR?
About $1 for someone, every time someone asks me about the EUDR, I would be owning a Caribbean island and not doing this webinar, guys. I'm not gonna lie. There's a lot of questions around this right now. The EUDR does require geolocation. The Lacey Act does not. I will very, very briefly, and this is my own personal opinion, say I think the rollout of the EUDR is going to be incredibly, we'll call it problematic and rough. And so I've gotten a lot of questions. Well, do you think the US Lacey Act is going to be amended to be the same as the EUDR? I don't think that's coming anytime soon, simply because, even EU nations now are kind of freaking out about how they're going to handle geolocation, and they haven't been able to find someone to do the risk evaluation for the supplying countries. So I think personally, we have quite a few years of the EUDR sort of finding its feet before we ever have to worry about the US amending anything. And I will say, as an add-on to that, anyone who has opened a paper in the last 2 years will know that Congress is kind of a mess and they can't pass even basic pieces of legislation like funding the government. So I feel pretty confident that we are not looking at amending something like the Lacey Act, which would require bipartisanship and is not absolutely necessary. So as of now, no geolocation. I don't think it's coming in the immediate future.
Thank
We've
you.
got time for maybe a couple more questions before we have to wrap up. Ashley, can you go back to put your slide back up with your contact information so people can have that? And we'll do our best after this presentation to make sure people who attended today, maybe we can even send them the presentation and get them the contact information as well. Craig, why don't you see if we can squeeze out a couple more of these?
Yep. We've got about 2 minutes to go here till we hit the witching hour. From Kyle. What is the difference between this declaration of this webcast versus standard Lacey Act submissions for kitchen tools, trays, bowls, etc., already being imported for the housewares industry?
So I don't know your specific products. It is possible that some of your products may have been covered by an earlier declaration. So you may already be filing the Lacey Act declaration for some of your products. If you are already filing a Lacey Act declaration, this is the same one. If there's something else that you're filing that isn't Lacey Act, then I'm not quite sure what that would be. But because this has been a phased-in approach, it's very possible that some of your products may have been covered by an earlier phase.
Very good. Now we've got just a couple more. I think we can shoehorn them in. We have from Matthew, excellent seminar. Thank you, Matthew. And you can thank Ashley for that. Could you supply or give some examples of a documentation trail that would suffice as evidence?
Sure. So it's really going to be, I hate to say this, it's really going to be dependent on your supply chain because every company and country is going to be different. So, in any country, you're probably going to be looking at, a harvest permit, whatever their equivalent is. Sometimes you're going to have to be looking at CITES depending on the species, but harvest permit, any sort of operational or transit permits that are required, any sort of processing, like it's really going to be sort of a paperwork trail of everything that is happening to that piece of wood as it is transformed. That you're also going to, on top of that, want to look at things like labor, right? Again, doing that research as to what concerns might be, if you want to build in, like, depending on the country, do they have specific labor prohibitions that you have to be aware of, or whatever that looks like? It's really going to require, unfortunately, doing some research in the country of origin or country of transit or processing or wherever you're looking at, and see what is required there. I'm sorry, I can't give you a list.
You're on mute, Craig.
Pardon me, we're right at the end, and this couldn't be a better question. First, there's a statement from Kyle. We've been submitting Lacey Act forms for these products for years already. Bravo. But the next question is, where can we find the list from Natalie of HTS numbers that fall under the Lacey Act declaration? And that's what we're waiting for with this Federal Register notice.
So you can go to their website and see everything that's currently covered. Just do Google APHIS, HTS Lacey, and it should bring it up pretty quickly. The Federal Register notice coming out will have a very lengthy list of HTS codes that will now be covered.
Well, Ashley, I want to thank you for yet another very informative presentation, and I'm sure there's so much in there for people who attended today to digest. Craig, thank you for supporting this as well in your role as Government Affairs Liaison for IHA. IHA and its publication, Homepage News, will continue to keep the industry up to date on when the declaration goes into effect and all other subsequent developments related to the Lacey Act. It surprises me how many people did not know about this, and we're doing our part to make sure we fill in those gaps right now. Ashley, thank you very much. Craig, thanks so much. And to all of our attendees today, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on the next IHA webinar.
Thank you.